I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. Hey, see if this sounds familiar. You're driving Highway 26 toward downtown Portland and everything's going great until you get over the top of the Sylvan Hill and discover gridlock. You look over to see the MAX train zipping past, but what you may not see is it does not get much farther than you before it has to slow way down as well. In fact, that is a big problem for all the light rail trains. They all have to slow way down when they arrive in Portland. What can be done about that? Well, that, my friends, is our big story tonight. Portlanders who have visited places like New York, London, or even Seattle may have noticed other cities don't have as much of a downtown slowdown, and that's often thanks to downtown train tunnels. It's big, it's expensive, and it's not going to happen here anytime soon. But a downtown MAX tunnel is a real possibility for the future. TriMet, Metro, and local transit advocates have all put some thought into what that would look like. Digital producer Anthony Masuk has our story.
Running on dense streets and surrounded by mixed traffic, MAX trains are limited to just 15 miles per hour when they cross downtown Portland. And when you factor in station stops and waiting for cross traffic, the average speed is even slower. TriMet knows it's a problem, and in recent years they've tried to speed things up by closing some downtown stations that were too close together and upgrading the tracks on the steel bridge so trains can cross a little faster. Those improvements help, but only marginally. Right now, it still takes 22 minutes for a train to travel between Goose Hollow and the Lloyd Center. The next station on the chopping block is Skidmore Fountain, but according to TriMet, taking it out will save only 40 seconds.
To truly speed things up, you have to get the trains off the streets altogether. That's where a tunnel comes in. TriMet and Metro have both looked into the idea, first with a TriMet study in 2017 and then with a Metro study 2 years later.
The studies were prompted by a separate but related problem.
And there's a bit of a bottleneck at the steel bridge.
All 5 MAX lines converged across the river at that single point, so any problems on the bridge will ripple through the entire system. Just last week, a derailed freight train shut down the bridge for hours, blocking every MAX line. And even when things are going well, there's an upper limit to how many MAX trains can cross per hour.
We're not at the upper limit currently, but future changes and improvements to the system could put us towards the upper limit.
TriMet and Metro looked at options like adding more tracks on the steel bridge or building a second bridge to split the load. But those ideas have drawbacks, like unbalancing the bridge deck or creating impractically long on-ramps, and they wouldn't speed trains up through the rest of downtown. Metro concluded that a tunnel is the best option because it would solve both problems, and it has other benefits like the possibility of longer trains that aren't constrained by the width of Portland's city block. The tunnel, as envisioned in the study, would be exclusively for the Blue Line, turning it into a sort of express route. The other lines would keep serving existing surface stations, but they would all benefit from the change.
By reducing the number of trains using the bridge, you eliminate some of those reliability issues that you had before. And you have a great time savings for folks riding the tunnel. We found an 11-minute savings from Lloyd Center to Goose Hollow on the Blue Line.
The exact tunnel route wouldn't be determined until the project got further into development. But Metro and TriMet studies mapped out similar example paths. The new tracks would split off by the Goose Hollow station and continue down Jefferson Street, diving underground to pass below Interstate 405. The tunnel would continue east toward downtown, then turn and head north near 6th Avenue, roughly paralleling the green and yellow line tracks above ground. It would then turn east again, passing under the river and lining up under Holiday Street, popping back out and rejoining the current tracks just after the Lloyd Center. The total tunnel length would be about 3.5 miles. The number and location of the stations would still need to be determined.
4 underground stations is what we studied, what we looked at, but a lot more analysis is needed. That's why we went to voters in 2020 with the Get Moving transportation measure, seeking funding to take this to the next step of environmental review and further design.
That 2020 ballot measure would have imposed a payroll tax to fund a host of regional transportation projects, including studying a downtown tunnel and building a new light rail line to Tigard. But voters rejected it, putting both MAX projects on an indefinite hold. Metro could pursue other funding sources for those projects, but it's choosing to leave them on the shelf for the moment.
The transportation measures failure forced us to put a couple of projects on hold until voters are ready again to talk about future investments in transit.
So, at least at the moment, it would be fair to call the tunnel a pipe dream.
But the MAX system is almost 40 years old, and we've built several big additions during that time, including a tunnel through the West Hills. So it's worth asking, why don't we have a downtown tunnel already?
If you ask local transportation activists, it's not for lack of trying. Jim Howell is the director of the Association of Oregon Rail Transit Advocates, or AORTA, and he's been involved in Portland transportation planning since the 1970s, when advocates pushed the city to ditch the Mount Hood Freeway in favor of building the original MAX line from Gresham to downtown Portland. He says there was talk of a downtown tunnel all the way back then, but it didn't really fit with the vision for light rail, which was supposed to be a more affordable option than a full metro system by keeping trains on the surface.
But that's why we picked light rail, because it was cheap.
The western half of the Blue Line was built as an extension off that original line, and so were the red and yellow lines. So each new addition continued to use the slow downtown tracks and the steel bridge. Howell and other AORTA members say the biggest missed opportunity for a tunnel was during construction of the Green Line, which opened in 2009. The line was going to follow a new route through downtown, and Howell said advocates pushed for that route to be a tunnel underneath 4th Avenue. But again, it didn't happen. The bus and transit mall along 5th and 6th Avenues was rebuilt with light rail tracks, creating a second surface-level route through downtown and adding a 4th line to the steel bridge, choices that AORTA says doubled down on problems instead of fixing them. Howell says the system's overall development was too piecemeal, without enough consideration for how each addition would connect with what was already there or the constraints that it would place on future additions. As a contrast, he pointed to the rail systems in Seattle and Vancouver, BC, which mostly run in tunnels or on viaducts rather than on city streets. Seattle took longer to start building its light rail system, but it's been rapidly catching up.
They're far ahead of us. At one time, we were far ahead of them.
Howell says a downtown tunnel in Portland would help undo some of the constraints that have become baked into the MAX system over time. He knows it's not going to happen anytime soon, but he says there's something else we could be doing in the meantime. We can't speed trains up without a tunnel, but we could try to run more of them.
You notice we talked about Seattle. Seattle's runs every 8 minutes. We run every 15 minutes. That is a huge difference in ridership potential. Frequency is far more important than speed.
This gets back to the original problem in the TriMet and Metro studies, the steel bridge. When you merge all the lines onto one set of tracks, one train every 15 minutes becomes 4, and that's just in one direction.
It's just about clogged up, and therefore, if you start talking about increasing the frequency, say down to 10-minute headways, that would be 6 trains an hour on each line. You're out of space. You can't do it.
Howell has some ideas to tackle that problem that would be faster and cheaper than a tunnel, like building an above-ground route for the Yellow Line on the Inner East Side, or scaling back the Red Line to only run between Gateway Transit Center and the airport. Riders might have to make more transfers, but the trade-off would be pulling 2 lines off the steel bridge, allowing every line to run more often.
Anthony's with me now. What an interesting story. But what about some of these ideas? Would TriMet really go for shortening that red line?
Honestly, probably not. They just spent $200 million upgrading the red line and working on a plan to extend it further west, so they probably wouldn't want to cut it back at this point.
Yeah, I could see that. All right, and if there was a tunnel built, how much would that cost?
Okay, so in 2017, TriMet's estimate was up to about $2 billion, and then just a couple years later in 2019, Metro's estimate was up to about $4.5 billion.
Whoa!
Yeah, and then we had the pandemic and we had inflation, so this was all before that. So we don't really know more than that, but it would be a lot.
Yeah, but it sounds like it's not going to happen anytime soon then.
No. Not really.
And also kind of the report, which was very thorough and very fascinating, but it also made me feel like this was kind of an urgent problem. But looking back at the ridership numbers, it looks like the numbers are down quite a bit from their peak.
They are, yeah. They're down not only from the pandemic, but also the peak was actually in more like 2012. And then it kind of plateaued until the pandemic arrived after that. crashed during the pandemic, and they've recovered in the last couple years since then, but not all the way.
Yeah.
So this is very much kind of a long-term project. The only way it becomes a little more urgent is if you want to increase the frequency more than it is right now. And that's kind of what Jim Howell was talking about, is if you're good with how things are right now, then yeah, the ridership for now doesn't support more than that. But if you want to make things better than they are now, then even now you're starting to run into a bit of a bottleneck with how often the trains can run.
And I guess if you look out into the future, it's not like we're going to have long-term stagnation for the population. At least I don't think so.
Yeah, let's hope not.
Yeah.
If assuming we don't, then yeah, in the long run, Metro said they consider this kind of a blip, the pandemic that is. In the long run, they still think that the ridership is probably just going to keep going up. And so eventually the steel bridge problem becomes kind of insurmountable.
Yeah, so whether it's 20 years from now or 30 years from now, a lot of folks probably think the time to start working on it and thinking about it is right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the pandemic may have delayed things a couple years, but they sort of see in the long run, this doesn't change the trajectory we're on.
Interesting. All right. Anthony Massoud, thanks for joining us. Very interesting stuff.
Thanks.
So now it's your turn. What do you think about all this? Should a downtown tunnel be a priority for MAX service? Why or why not? Email us, will you? Send us an email to thestory@kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090. Now let's get to Multnomah County's ambulance crisis, because over the weekend we had another example of level 0. That's when no ambulances are available, forcing police and fire to get creative. Just after midnight Sunday morning, police were called to a stabbing in the Rockwood neighborhood around 181st and Burnside. A man had a head wound and multiple stab wounds, but ambulance provider AMR was on level 0. That means their crews were all tied up. And the ambulance that was assigned to respond to the scene was coming all the way from Clackamas.
The firefighters at the scene decided it was in the best interest of the patient to have them transported immediately.
Thankfully, law enforcement said, hey, just throw him in our car, we'll take him. So our paramedic from Engine 31 jumped in the back of the police cruiser and they drove to the closest hospital.
This is probably the first police transport I can think of for our agency.
Well, thank heavens they did that, but come on. Unfortunately, it's not the first non-ambulance transport of a patient in Multnomah County. We've told you how fire trucks, other police agency vehicles, in at least one case, a TriMet bus, all used to rush somebody to the hospital. All because an ambulance was not available or too far away. Last year, Multnomah County saw nearly 15,000 calls to 911 where no ambulances were immediately available to respond. In this latest case, as of yesterday afternoon, the victim is in critical condition but is expected to survive. This ambulance crisis is nothing new. Investigative reporter Evan Watson has been covering it for the past 2 years. From a nationwide paramedic shortage to Multnomah County sticking with its unique 2 paramedic requirement instead of 1 paramedic and 1 EMT like the surrounding counties do, there's a lot of background there. You can catch up anytime on the KGW YouTube channel. Just go in there and search ambulance. Coming up next on The Story, you may have seen the famous zebra in the state of Washington that was on the run for several days before being tracked down late last week. And you know, that got us thinking, are zebras legal to own in Washington and Oregon? We'll have the answer, plus a big surprise from the Oregon State veterinarian when The Story returns. So were you following along with that search for a missing zebra in Washington state? A lot of us were. The strange hunt is now over. The zebra mare was captured on Friday night after spending nearly a week running around the Cascades. It all started last weekend when 4 zebras escaped from a trailer on Interstate 90 in King County near North Bend, Washington. 3 of the zebras were corralled that day with the help of a rodeo clown. Can't make that up. But one of them, a mare called Sugar or Shug, got away. There were a few sightings throughout the week, and she inspired people to go out and search for her, but she wasn't caught until Friday night. She was found in a neighborhood, and it took animal control about 3 hours to round her up. Sugar became a bit of an animal celebrity. Along with the search, there were zebra memes all over social media. The zebras were being transported from Lewis County to western Montana for a petting zoo there. But it does beg the question, how did a group of zebras get to Washington state in the first place? Well, we dug into it because that's what we do. Turns out it's perfectly legal to own zebras in both Washington and Oregon. The states essentially consider them livestock. Here's the Oregon state veterinarian to explain.
There's only 5 categories of animals that we regulate, and those are generally dangerous exotic animals. Everything else from the standpoint of our rules are considered to be livestock. And so we regulate them from the health standpoint. There are requirements we impose for importation in the state, different things like that. But something like a zebra is considered the equivalent of a horse. It's considered another equid. And there are a handful of them that exist in the state that do live here. And we know that, zebras and horses are actually able to interbreed too. And so that creates some additional conflicts there.
Didn't think about that. You want to know what else is on the Oregon's list of non-controlled species? Elephants, giraffes, and hippos, among others. Yes, it's apparently legal under state law to own an elephant in Oregon. And Dr. Scholl says he knows of someone who has some.
There is an individual here in Oregon that owns a couple of elephants privately even, but they fall under USDA animal care's jurisdiction. So they are licensed with USDA. We don't license them. They're, that's not a regulated species. We only regulate those 5 categories that we are given authority to regulate. Otherwise, our regulations are all about health and making sure the animals come here are healthy, but not necessarily prohibiting them.
So yeah, the feds are pretty heavily involved. Now, if you're going to go get an elephant or a zebra or many other kinds of animals, you need a license from the federal USDA. And then, of course, there are local ordinances to think about and zoning. For instance, in Portland, you are allowed to have an equine animal, horses, mules, donkeys, llamas, for example, within the city limits, but only if you have a big enough lot. It has to be over 20,000 square feet. We checked, and zebras fall into that category. The city of Portland said actually they enjoyed getting that question from us. By the way, did you know you're not even allowed to own a rooster in Portland, only female chickens? So yeah, lots of rules. Dr. Scholl says most of the zebras owned across the country are privately bred here in the U.S. We looked into it. They go for a couple of $1,000s if you can find a breeder. So we thought you'd be interested to know about that. What do you think about all that? Should animals like zebras and elephants be allowed in the Northwest? Have you ever seen exotic animals around here outside of a zoo? Let us know, will you? Send us an email. The address again, thestory@kgw.com, or call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090. And while we're on the topic of wildlife, many of you may remember this wild video out of the state of Washington. Hundreds of mountain goats being airlifted to a new home in the North Cascades. But once on the ground, it appears things did not go well. Of the goats that were relocated around 5 years ago, nearly all of them now presumed dead. Eric Wilkinson from our sister station in Seattle shows us why the person behind that high-flying effort says these results show the complexity of nature.
Around 2020, hundreds of mountain goats were moved from the Olympic Peninsula to the North Cascades. Researchers tracked 151 of them. To this day, only 4 are known to have survived. Still, researchers say the efforts were not a failure. It was an effort to help Northwest mountain goats survive. Crews used tranquilizer darts before blindfolding the creatures for their journey to their new environment. The goats were moved because they're not native to the peninsula or harming vegetation and becoming aggressive. In fact, one killed a hiker in 2010.
We're seeing more visitor impacts and vegetation impacts, so it's like we need to do something.
If the goats weren't relocated, Fish and Wildlife officials say they likely would have been hunted and killed by the state. A total of 325 were airlifted from the Olympic Mountains to the North Cascades over the course of 3 years. But almost all of those goats are now unaccounted for or presumed dead.
Was this a failure?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. You know, as in anything in the environment or biology, the picture is more complex, you know, the more you delve into it.
Patty Happy oversaw the project for Olympic National Park. She says the die-off is alarming, but not surprising. Happy concedes stress from the airlift likely contributed to some deaths, but old age and predation were likely factors, and dead batteries on radio collars caused researchers to lose track.
The tightest relationship to those declines is it's climate change. It's that warmer summers that lead to poor forage conditions. And so the goats just don't go into winter in as good a shape, and that leads to die-off.
There are now only about 3,000 mountain goats in Washington compared to 10,000 60 years ago. And while that is cause for concern, Happy believes the situation isn't as dire as we might believe.
I don't think goats are disappearing from Washington state. It just may be that some patches of formerly suitable habitat no longer are.
Researchers now hope to track mountain goats in areas where they're doing well to find out what's going right there so they can use that information to help goats in other areas survive.
For tonight's Digging for Old, we're going to do a little This Day in History segment for you 89 years ago today, on May 6, 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 7034, creating the Works Progress Administration, also known as the WPA. It was one of the many Great Depression relief programs meant to put unemployed Americans back to work. You're looking at posters produced by various branches of the WPA. Not only were there construction and engineering jobs, but Portland had projects for writers, artists, and actors, as well as a women's division that emphasized household crafts. The Willamette Heritage Center says the WPA is to thank for the construction of post offices, customs buildings, and federal buildings from Burns to Tillamook. But the real jewel of the WPA work in Oregon is on the slopes of Mount Hood, Timberline Lodge. President Roosevelt dedicated the lodge in 1937. If you'd like to hear some of that speech, we have highlighted it in a Digging for Old segment a few weeks ago. It's available now on the KGW YouTube channel. You should check it out. It's great. Hey, that's the end of our show. Thanks for watching. And remember, the story, our collective story, it never ends. Straight Talk with Laurel Porter is coming your way next, and I'll see you right back here tomorrow night at 6:30.